I can do a quick introduction and then we can get started. Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us either in person or over online. Um, Today is my pleasure to have Muneeza here. So she's going to talk about her recent work entitled Policy-Driven Agentic Red Teaming. Muneeza is a senior machine learning engineer on the AI safety team at Red Hat, and previously she worked at IBM Research. She comes from a computational math background, and nowadays she's an expert and also really excited about building AI safety and specifically building automating safety testing of AI models and agents in a dynamic policy landscape. Again, she's going to talk about her recent work on AI safety and also red teaming. We all know building agents and also making sure before deploying agent in production-ready environment, we need to do a lot of testing and especially red teaming. Just a fun fact before she starts talking about her research. This is the first time many people reach out to me in Slack asking me how to attend random samples and where to find recordings. So that means a lot of people internally, they're also really caring about safety and red teamings, and they're also really excited about your talk today, Muneeza. So I think I talked too much. Yeah, but without further ado, yeah, please take it away.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that intro. I'm excited to hear that people are excited about this. But yeah, I'm Muneeza, and I'm going to be talking about some really cool stuff that we've been doing at the AI safety team here at Red Hat. These are, really cool folks that I work with. I do want to preface this presentation or this talk by saying that as I was finishing my slides last night, I realized this is going to be more of an overview rather than a research deep dive, just because of the amount of content that I'm going to cover. But I thought it was necessary to cover all of these aspects for the sake of completeness. The work that I'm going to be presenting, I'm going to present at DEF CON next week. And for those of you who don't know, DEF CON is one of the, if not the biggest conference on security, hacking, red teaming, all of that. So excited for that. So this would be my, little practice talk. All right, motivation, question mark. Do I really need to motivate this? Not really, because AI security and safety related incidents have been, proliferating in their prevalence. Like every day we hear something, a new agent broke out of the sandbox, tried to, hack something. The recent and most hyped of these being the OpenAI Hugging Face incident. And for me, I really like this awesome AI agents attack a GitHub project because it lists all of the, verified incidents of, AI agents either curating attack or being, having been attacked successfully. And really one of the biggest signals to me was when, organizations like OWASP, which previously had done only cataloging of hypothetical scenarios of agents failing, are now in 2026, they're cataloging actual CVEs and actual incidents. So, hence the panic cat, like this needs attention. Okay, so, acknowledging that this is an area that needs a lot of work, it needs, our attention right now. Let's look at how organizations actually operationalize AI safety when they want to avoid incidents like the ones that I showed earlier. And this happens mainly by answering 3 questions. Organizations usually, try and answer these 3 questions to operationalize safety for their AI systems. And the first one is, what should my safety boundary look like, right? Given the system that I'm developing, given my use case, given the regulatory and legal landscape that I'm operating in, what should the safety boundary look like? And this is more aspirational, goal setting type of question. And it's typically answered from a policy and governance lens, right? You write policies, you have these detailed governance documents that tell you what the safety boundary should look like. The second question is more on, the technical side. Well, once I've defined this aspirational boundary, what is the actual boundary of my system, right? What is the real boundary that defines the behavior of my agent or my system? And this is determined or defined, or actually, brought to light, right, by red teaming and evaluations. So you stress test your system, and you try and see what it violates, what it doesn't, and that kind of helps you define that boundary. And then the third question is, if there's a mismatch in boundaries, how do I make sure that my system boundary is actually within my safety boundary? How is that enforced? And that's usually where we do a lot of the alignment and guardrailing. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking about the define and test part, so policy governance and how that interacts with AI teaming, red teaming, and evals. I'm not going to be talking about guardrailing, but there's some really cool work that is happening in our team. Reach out to Rob, Mac, or Christina if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing to enforce some of this stuff. Okay, so as I mentioned, operationalizing AI safety really boils down to answering these two questions. What's really interesting and kind of the main pain point is that these two questions are answered in very different languages by people that have different, really different backgrounds, right? So for example, a policy and governance, a policy document would be it's aspirational prose that is fairly agnostic of the architecture. It sometimes has use case information, but not to the level of detail that you need in order to be able to curate those tests and then run those tests on your agent, right? Using whatever framework, Garrick, Agent Dojo, Pirate Dream. And so even though there's really cool research happening within these independent areas, the research isn't really easily translatable from one to other, and then the other to, from policy to red teaming and red teaming to policy. One answer to this was creating risk taxonomies, and this is great because now risk taxonomies essentially give a structure to the language of policy. It codifies the risks that the policy brings to light, right? And it helps, give identities, reference, give identities to risk. It helps us reference those risks, compare them, and track them, which is all, really important and needed to be able to do red teaming in a meaningful way. However, again, even within risk taxonomy research, and this is more of, if you think about policy and governance, it's a lot of like folks with, social sciences background, governance background. When you think about red teaming, it's like mostly folks like you and I, really technical backgrounds. When you think about risk taxonomy, it's really most of the research is coming from the HCI, space. So because of the epistemological differences that exist within each of these components, it's really hard to translate one from another and do red teaming that is meaningful in a way that it's auditable and traceable. So really the question that I'm trying to ask is, how can we do red teaming that will allow us to tie these results that are coming from tools? These are actual numbers, ASRs, metrics, right? How do we tie that back to the policy, which is actually what is needed when you are, getting certified, or it's actually what's sort of, it defines your regulatory and legal space that you operate in. And so you have to show that you comply with this policy, right? In a way that is auditable and traceable. How can you trace back your, a bunch of red teaming results, which is a very, concrete metrics, back to a policy document, which is like very aspirational, written in prose, right? And this is not trivial. This is like a app that exists in this space, just because of how disconnected those three research spaces are. And so what are we doing at AI Safety? one thing that we're doing, which I'm really excited about, is that our team is actually getting ready to launch an upstream AI safety community with the goal to bring all of those people from the regulatory background, from really technical industry and academic background, and sort of bring them together to fill in these gaps. I think it has not been announced externally, so please treat this as an internal only announcement. But shout out to my team, but like really what are we doing in terms of like, are there any methods that we're developing, or like how are we bridging this gap? And so this is kind of our proposed approach for doing that. And really what it comes down to is that we take a policy document that's written sort of from a broad governance risk, and we then map it to an existing taxonomy of risks. What it does is that it gives us a structured, codified mapping of risks in a way that is, relational and traceable. And it also reduces the space of our problem to the risks that are, it reduces the space of our problem down to the risks that are relevant to the policy that we're dealing with right now. Okay. But up until this point, up until this map to risk taxonomy point, we are still fairly, because if you read these risk taxonomies, they're fairly broad. They're written in a really broad language. So they're agnostic of your use case, and they're agnostic of the specific architecture that you have. And so in order to see if your system is susceptible to any of these risks, we then generate scenarios. And scenarios are essentially the way in which a risk will manifest itself in a given architecture and a given use case, right? For example, tool misuse, what does that look like for different types of tools, given that my agent has access to these tools? And again, adding this information of architecture and use case narrows down our problem space further, because the policy can refer to risks that are not relevant to the architecture, right? So for example, the policy can mention, or the taxonomy can have agent-to-agent risk, but if your architecture is, it's a single agent working with a bunch of tools, you don't really care about that, right? Really. So it constricts your space of plausible ways in which risks can manifest themselves, right? And then once you have those scenarios, you then take them and run them on downstream red teaming tools. So for example, you can have, and these different red teaming tools work on different layers of the model. They require different support. So some red teaming tools only do input-output probing. Some red teaming tools, require generating synthetic tools, synthetic environment, placing injections in those synthetic environments. So really, based on the choice of your downstreaming red teaming tool, you're going to need different ways of writing that scenario or codifying that scenario. Really, it's essentially an artifact that your red teaming tool needs in order to execute that scenario. And again, we're still restricting our problem space by our choice of red teaming tools as well, because not all red teaming tools can test all scenarios, right? That's a limitation of the tool itself. So as we add more and more information, more and more detail, we're making our problem space smaller and making it more easier to deal with, and easier to traverse. But by adding those details, we're also traversing it in a very structural way. So what does that mean? Let me show you an example. Hopefully that'll help. So let's say we start with a policy. This is a chunk of the policy which says act only within granted authority, don't perform unauthorized actions, The risk taxonomy will extract a bunch of different risks from this, right? And these are coming from different risk taxonomies. That's a whole nother thing. You have multiple standardized risk taxonomies, and different people use different risk taxonomies to see coverage, to see compliance. So you have to make sure that whatever mapping you're doing is translatable from one taxonomy to another. All right, so you map, so you identify all of the risks from your policy. And I'm going to show one worked example. So let's say we look at tool misuse. And how do I then generate scenarios for tool misuse? I need to know what type of tools my agent has access to or my system has access to. Does it even have access to tools, right? How is it accessing tools? Does it have controls on what and how it can use? And so you add all of that architectural information. And so, for example, you can misuse, through sending a wrong, email or leak data, tool misuse, depending on the essentially different channels that you have, the tool misuse can look slightly different, right? And then let's say I want to test for tool misuse on the refund tool, and I want to test if it issues refunds incorrectly without the proper authorization, right? But my framework of choice is Garrick, which only lets me do input-output type of probing. And so the way in which I will write this scenario or codify the scenario for Garrick to be able to run it will be a very different version. So essentially, I will just write a probe and a detector that can detect that a issue was refunded. Versus if I were doing it in Agent Dojo, it would look much, much different, right? So hopefully this walkthrough made sense. Just FYI, I can't really see anyone. So if folks have questions, just feel free to interrupt me. Okay. And so now I'm going to walk through each of the, components individually.
Muneeza, can I ask a quick question?
Yep.
Can you go back to the last slide?
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand this framework, but I wonder if this system is more like a static system or a dynamic system. Let's say initially you write some scenarios for tool misuse, but then later you realize there's something you didn't consider, maybe the tool result, you didn't expect that to happen, and you want to update the system to include the scenario into your existing framework. I wonder if that's the case, or you kind of predefine everything.
Okay, so up until the scenarios, everything is sort of predefined, because scenarios are written descriptions of how a tool misuse attack through a refund would look like. So it's very descriptive, and I'll show you an example later on. But when you're actually generating the artifacts for red teaming tools, for example, for Agent Dojo, which actually runs the tool, you will do a dry run and see that for this particular task, is the model even using this tool in this way, right, that I described? Because I construct a scenario where I say the model is going to call this tool, but for this, let's say task, is the model even calling this tool? And then what is the output? Is the injection even surfacing when the model interacts with these tools? Because you place the injection in the environment. So there's a loop there, which makes sure that your attack happens in the way it's described in the scenario. So there's a feedback loop in the artifact generator, which makes sure that the attack runs the way that it is defined. However, if, let's say, a new tool or a new capability is added, then you need to expand that by generating more scenarios. Did that answer your question?
I think that answer, but I wonder, you mentioned you will do a dry run. Let's say you use Agent Dojo, you do a dry run and you get some feedback. But is it going to be used to update the artifact and also even the scenario? Or
it'll be used to update the artifact, not the scenario.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Just because we treat the scenario as sort of the ground truth for what we're testing.
Yeah. I see. I understand. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, so the first chunk of this is the policy mapper. How are we mapping these policies to these really beautiful risk taxonomies? And I had the slide here to talk about like why it was important to map to risk taxonomies. I'm not sure if like it's, you know, it's important because the taxonomies really codify the loose, you know, they codify and give structure sort of to the loose prose of your policy, and it makes it traceable, comprehensive, auditable, and you know, you're able to, it's easier to map one taxonomy to another, to go from like one risks to threats. And then it also, a lot of the taxonomies have like sub risk categories, which makes it really easy to traverse and then test different combinations. So make like really, really rich scenarios as you traverse the taxonomy, right? Really. And then as we were doing this, I think our, you know, policy mapper was out. This blog from Anthropic came out where they did like a really cool mapping on the MITRE ATT&CK taxonomy. And so it's always like a really good affirmation when the Frontier Lab is doing something similar as well. Okay, so how does a policy mapper work? How much time do I have? Okay, I have time. So the policy mapper essentially, you know, the main sort of flow is we take the PDF, we, you know, parse it, we create chunks of, you know, we create chunks from the parsed document, and each chunk is tagged with the page number and the section, I think, or the subsection. And really the idea is to have that auditability, that traceability. A lot of the policies are really, really written really broadly. Some of them have, you know, talk about risks that aren't directly testable using red teaming, like, you know, training your workforce and stuff like that. That's not something that's testable. So we kind of filter that stuff out. And then using, you know, we build queries on top of the chunk. I'll show later why, but we essentially use those queries to retrieve relevant risks from those taxonomies. And we have a hybrid retrieval method. And then once we retrieve, let's say like the top 5 or 10 risks for a particular query, we then run it through, again, the chunk, the query, and the risks through an LLM to identify the exact sort of like phrase within that chunk that sort of gives evidence to the risk, right? And we ask LLM to give the confidence for each candidate. And we also do the mapping, right? So this is static, you know, SOM, which is like simple standard for sharing ontology mappings. And this is not really LLM driven. It's essentially a way for you to map one taxonomy onto another. It's fairly straightforward. Okay, so how does the retrieval work? So let's you know, look at this example. Let's say we have a chunk that says, well, no financial, I think this is just like an excerpt of the policy that prose that I shared earlier. Let's say this is the chunk that we have. It gets tagged with page number and section. And we realized that we really needed to generate the query. And this is, again, work done by my teammates. So if folks have more detailed questions, feel free to reach out to me and I will forward, you know, connect you with them. But really the main idea here is that because, again, the language of the policy is so different from the language of the taxonomy, is so different from the way in which artifacts are written, that we need to translate this policy into things that the taxonomy recognizes. So for example, no financial adjustment, we build 1 to 3 queries for it. So for example, the first query would be unauthorized actions, privilege escalation, exceeding granted permissions. And so each of these queries, we run retrievals, so either through keyword matching or semantic similarity. And then we have 2 ordered lists from these 2 retrievals, and we do RRF. So essentially we get 1 ordered list. And we then run a cross-encoder re-ranking on the top 50 of them, because I think the total number of risks is like 485, and it's really expensive to do cross-encoder ranking on all of them because it does it pairwise for each query and each risk. It'll cross-encode them and give the similarity metric. And so it's cheaper to do it for just the top 50 ones, and the by-encoder and the keyword matching is fairly fast. And then the top, I think 5 or 10 risks that are identified by the cross encoder are our candidate risks for these chunk. And those are what we, move forward for grounding. So the LLM will look at the chunk, will look at the risks, and we ask it to identify the exact phrase within that passage or within that chunk that relates to the risk. And so essentially at the end of this, you will get something like this. You will get a risk extraction file, which will have all of these risks, right, that you have extracted. And what is this? This is the query that was used. This is the confidence, this exact phrasing. And then it also lists what this risk, the risk ID in other taxonomies. Okay, so that's kind of how we're doing the mapping. The second part of it is the scenario generation. Essentially, okay, so up until the point, up until the risk mapping, we still are fairly, agnostic of the architecture, right? Because there might be risks that are in the policy that are not directly applicable to the current architecture. And so having that use case or architecture information narrows down our problem space even further, and that's what the scenario generator does. Okay. This is essentially the flow of how the scenarios are generated. So initially we take, right now we're just taking a written description of the use case and the system's architecture. So like, what are the different zones? I forgot to put the zone information here, but we've defined 5 zones. So zone 1 is the input surface. Zone 2 is the planning and reasoning that's happening, within the model itself. Zone 3 is tool execution. Zone 4 is memory and state, and zone 5 is inter-agent communication. So you can imagine how different systems will have different zones enabled for them based on their capabilities, based on their architecture profile. And that's kind of what we identify in this architecture profile. We then, okay, this is kind of interesting. So once we have the architecture profile, we then map the risk cards to threat IDs. So essentially, and this is like some like red teaming, really, how do I say, baggage? No, not baggage, approach, is that you have different taxonomies for risks, which are essentially defined as the outcome that you're protecting against, right? And you have a different taxonomy for threats, which is defined as the method that produces the outcome, right? So the risk would be unauthorized refund happens, and then the method would be attacker hides an instruction in a payload, So the method or the threat would be, prompt injection via retrieved content that is, that has been injected or polluted, right? And so that's kind of, it's again, static. It's really well defined, but this is again, going from the policy language, because the risk taxonomies are written closer to the policy language, and the threat taxonomies are written closer to the actual implementation language. And so that mapping happens, and then we filter by the profile, right? Exactly. So the risks or the threats that act in zones that are not active in our architecture, right? So if inter-agent communication is not happening, we just filter out that risk card or that threat. Okay, so once we have a filtered version of the threat taxonomy, which is effectively the risk taxonomy, but expressed differently, we then expand the threats. And this is exactly why we use the threat taxonomy, because each of the threats have subcategories of how of different attack patterns. So for example, if if the threat was tool misuse, right? The subcategories would be tool misuse via prompt injection, or tool misuse via parameter pollution, or tool misuse via DDoS attack, right? And so it becomes really easy to construct these diverse attacks by traversing the threat taxonomy that has all of these sub-attack patterns. Okay, I think that's kind of how the seeds are generated. And then once you have the seeds, we use an LLM to generate a scenario. And the scenario in our case, we tried a bunch of different constructions of the scenario, but we ultimately have converged on a scenario that has these three components. Okay, so our scenario file essentially has these three components. It has all of the tags in the top, right? So what the threat tag is, what the sub, agent attack pattern tag is, what the entry points are, and how the zones are being traversed in this particular scenario. And so our scenario consists of a description of the attacker. So what is the capability level of the attacker, what resources they have, and what are their goals? Then we have a written sort of narrative description of the attack itself, right? How the attack unfolds, the entry points, and zone sequences, all of that written in a narrative way. And we found that this is really useful. It's really useful to have this written prose when we're using this later to generate artifacts using LLMs. And then it also has an attack tree, which is sort of like the same goal, but decomposed into sub goals and then mapped to the sub attack pattern types within that threat taxonomy, right? So for example, let me just read through this. A buyer files a dispute and uploads an order note, and the text of the dispute note has a hidden instruction. And so when the support agent retrieves this note, to summarize, the instruction tells us to issue a full refund, and the buyer isn't authorized to trigger this action. And so the attack tree traverses this, breaks it down into steps, and then tags these steps with the zones that are currently being affected in the current step, right? So is it the input? Is it the model reasoning trace? Is it a tool call, or is it the state being altered? And then we also have this behavioral spec. And this was really cool because we were looking into like behavioral modeling. A lot of the red teaming tools use some type of like intent modeling or behavioral modeling. And we used Gherkin for this. And Gherkin is essentially a behavioral domain, a domain-specific language for behavioral modeling. And what it does is that it breaks down the scenario in this way, like given, and, when, then, but, right? And it's still written text, but it identifies different parts of the attack. And why is this important? It's important because it lets you identify meta trends in your red teaming results, right? So for example, you can, for all the scenarios and the downstream red teaming runs that you do, you can extract the when clause, right? What was the agent doing when it encountered a specific injection, right? And see the ASR for that. And you were able to identify, well, my agent is particularly weak against tool return injections, right? And so this is really what differentiates from a normal red teaming run that kind of gives you an ASR. But the power of using behavioral modeling is that it allows you to uncover meta trends within your model's behavior, right? Rather than just doing ad hoc red teaming. It gives you a structured way to control that. And then it also gives you a really cool way to control your coverage, right? Because you can see in when you can replace this with all possible channels that this can happen. And so that, was really cool. And obviously we tried running the downstream LLM artifact generator without the behavioral spec. And it's just, does a really good job of like one-shotting it when it has this behavioral spec. Hopefully I haven't lost folks yet, but we move on to the last part, which is the artifact generator. And essentially what it deals with is, once you have those scenarios, which are, again, as you saw, these are descriptive written files that tell you how a specific risk can manifest given a chain, right? Given a path. However, not all red teaming tools can model that path really, or observe it. Essentially, that's what we want to do, right? Can place the injection and observe it in that way. And so really, depending on the choice of your downstream red teaming tool, you can modify how you run the scenario, or like how you, well, not really the scenario, but you can modify how you measure the success of a particular attack. Or you can say, I actually can't test this using this red teaming tool at all. And that's also, a valid data point, because then you need to build a tool for that specific type of scenarios. Okay, so like I said, you need to be able to run some type of feasibility check to see whether your red teaming platform can run a specific scenario or not. And right now, what we're doing, and I think we can add a lot more to this based on, because right now we have artifact generators for Garrick and Agent Dojo, but as we incorporate more downstream tools, I think this list is gonna get bigger, or we might add more questions. But primarily the two questions that we ask is, where does the attack sit, right? What part of the agentic loop, or the model's, not really model's loop, but what part of the agentic loop or the model's communication channel do I need to tap in to make sure that I can place that attack, right? So, and then it translates directly to, can my red teaming framework access this this place where the attack is sitting? And then the second one is, well, how do I observe? What part of the system do I need to observe to prove that this attack worked, right? Is it just the output? Do I need to look at the state? Do I need to look at the memory? Do I need to look at the tool calls? And that tells you whether or not you can test it. And I feel like I've been using Garrick and Agent Dojo pretty freely in this talk, but just to give a little bit of a context, Garrick is mostly an input probe type of red teaming framework, where you formulate, different, and you can get really creative with them. You formulate an input prompt essentially, and you probe your model with that, and you look at the model's generated output. So it doesn't currently, I mean, I know they're trying to work on it, but it currently doesn't have a lot of like agentic pathways for red teaming. And the Agent Dojo on the other hand allows you to essentially mock up everything that surrounds your agent and test it. So once you do this feasibility, you're essentially looking for tags in the scenario generator to see where what the entry point is, and then how do you prove that it worked? And you say a scenario is fully feasible for a given red teaming tool if it can place the attack, if the tool can place the attack and observe the result directly. It's partial if it can place it, but can't observe it directly, but maybe it can observe it indirectly. So rather than being able to observe the state that was changed, maybe it can read the model's reasoning or the model's messaging, which says, okay, I will write this to memory, or okay, I will issue this, right? So even though you can't really see what's happening, under the hood, you still have a fair idea of, well, the model complied or didn't comply. And then the skip is like stuff that you just cannot place or cannot observe at all. For example, multi-agent interactions where you don't have access to the other agent's state at all, right? So you don't know how the other agent's state was modified or how the other agent's goal was misaligned. Okay. So once you have outlined the feasibility, or once you know what the feasibility is, then you run framework-specific artifact generation. So for Garrick, that essentially looks like because it is mostly from the input side, you create a conversation. For example, for the tool use, it will be, you will mock up a multi-turn conversation. That's like the easiest way to do it. Multi-turn conversation, and you will pause it. And this is like mocked up tool outputs. You will pause it to where the model or the agent encounters the injected payload, and then you will send that as a probe to your model. And then you will also define detection or validation predicates, so that those could be, the model says, you know, okay, I will call the process refund, or calls the tool, or in its reasoning, it says something to those, you know, along that line. And then for Agent Dojo, the same attack, right? The same scenario, which is like indirect injection for, let's say, that, you know, downstream issues a refund. You will instantiate the environment. You will create those tools. So for example, a, you know, list dispute, read dispute tool, process refund tool. These will all be Python functions. And then you will place the injection, which says, you know, forget about everything and just, you know, issue me the refund. And you will do the dry run, make sure that the injection, and this goes back to the question that you asked how initially, you do the dry run, you make sure that the tool call actually surfaces the injection. And this is based on a canary string. So you place it and then you evaluate. You define, looking at the diff in the environment, you evaluate. So the evaluation is actually deterministic, which is pretty cool. But you have to, the artifact in this case would be the Python functions for the tools, the synthetic data for the environment, with the injection placed in the environment, and the script that runs the predicates that compare your environment before and after. So that's how that works. And I'm going to show an example artifact just because, for Garrick, just because the artifact for Agent Dojo is kind of hard to show. It's a lot of code. But for the same scenario, the Garrick artifact is essentially a probe. This is a probe. Oh, y'all can't see my pointer. And a you know, detector that essentially is looking at keywords, which are your verification predicates. So the probe is, you know, a system message, and then fabricated history of user and assistant conversation, where the assistant calls the tool and it encounters the injection, and then you send this off to your model to see how the model reacts to it, right? Does it push back by saying, well, please confirm, I cannot authorize, or does it say, okay, let me issue you a refund? This is kind of a mock-up example, and you can see why Garrick would have partial coverage for something like this, because this is, again, you know, no real tool interaction is happening just because Garrick does input-output. Okay, recap and future work. So recap, really, what, you know, through these different components that we're working on, we're really trying to close the gap between you know, the policies that you know, auditors and government agencies and regulatory bodies care about, to the actual artifacts that the downstream red teaming frameworks need to be able to run, you know, different scenarios. That's what we're doing. What's next for us? Obviously, a part of, you know, big engineering effort is going to be focused on expanding different artifact generations for like different downstream red teaming platforms. So for example, for Microsoft Pirate, we haven't done that yet. We have our own sort of like red teaming framework or tool that we're working on. We call it Mid-Dojo, so expanding artifact generation for that. We also want to be able to scale the red teaming and then be able to extract the meta insights. And I think that's like a really cool research question that I'm interested in and excited to work on is like, once you have this, once you run this, how do you then extract those meta insights that are actually actionable, that highlight, well, a particular channel is the weak link, right? I feel like, because that's the kind of like insights that you really want from your red teaming exercise, really. And then flip it and reverse it. So can we use similar mappings to go from traces to policy documents and threats? Because really the current like safety practice is very reactive. Something fails and then you have to look at the traces and see what exactly happened. And so if we have an automated way of whatever traces we have running, we, keep mapping them to like the policies or to the different risk taxonomies or even threat taxonomies, like that gives us a really good visual into, well, what's the area that we need to sort of like focus on and maybe put more engineering effort into making this area a little bit secure or not. So that's kind of what's, future work. And thank you all. I know there's a lot of cat memes. I love cat memes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, this looks so cool. Any questions from Google Meet? Any questions from the room? Maybe I can ask a quick question first, and then we'll wait for others.
Sorry, let me share my screen again. I think I stopped sharing. Can y'all see my slides still? Sorry, go ahead with your question.
No, I think we see your we don't see your slides now.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think my question is, I think that at the very beginning of your talk, so you mentioned, I think something like from evaluation back to model. So basically, like say if you detect some issues when the model, like let's say like you write some scenarios and also artifacts, and then you detect the agent, say have some maybe like some issue with the wall calling or maybe some other issue you detect. So I wonder like if do you also have a way to go back to either model training or maybe agent harness to kind of fix that issue so the agent doesn't make that mistake in the future?
Yeah, that's the enforce question, really, is how do we, can you still see my slides when I move them around?
No, we only see your background.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, but yeah, it goes back to the enforce question, right? So, oh, I hate doing it like this.
Now we
see your slides.
Yeah.
Now you see them? Okay, awesome. So it goes back to this question of like, once we see that something is failing and the boundary doesn't align with what the boundary should be or what the agent should be doing, how do we then make it comply? So that could be retraining, that could be fine tuning, alignment, something post hoc, or that could be guardrailing. Folks in our team are working on that. I think one of the things that we're working on to connect this or to bridge this gap is like is a guardrailing catalog. And I know William's there and he can maybe talk more about that. But yeah, definitely our team is working on that. I don't think we're thinking of retraining, to be honest, really more on the guardrailing side of things. Yep.
Yeah, since you mentioned it. So part of what happened is that there's no mechanism to do generic guardrails because it's very specific to the model and the use case. And then you have to map that to the language, to the domain, to the vertical. So it's n-dimensional. It doesn't matter where you start. So even when we are thinking about this catalog, it's really templates that need to be modified based on what is actually detected. From, you see all those mechanisms to do the red teaming and to do everything based on what is the risk that you need to comply with, and then adapt from there. But for example, right now the team is focusing on the guardrailing, but part of where I want to expand this is not only on the guardrail level, but also do that interpretation for enforcing it at the harness level. And use that feedback as well to go back and, hey, can we eventually, not now, for example, the judge model, can we go and align the judge model for the evaluations to get better signals? Because right now we're assuming the judge models understand everything, but the reality is the use case will really, I mean, without proper informing from the traces, let's say, on how the behavior really is good or not, we cannot keep improving. And the idea with this, I mean, if we zoom out for a second, is when you are running an agent or something, using this process, you should be able to have infinite optimization mechanism for this by retrofitting into what you're learning from the traces, what you're learning from the new red teams that you did. So you go and optimize that. At one point, optimizations that you can do on guardrails will be maxed because latency or whatever. That should go back into the model. That should go back into also the judges. So it's a long road. But yeah, hopefully eventually we can get into those promises.
Got it. So just a quick question. So you're saying like there's something you're optimizing, like are optimizing the language model judge or optimizing the agent harness?
Yeah, both.
Oh, both.
The idea is to do both. Now, something that in a different work stream than this is to give the user, for example, because again, optimization is okay in which dimension and for which risk, is to give the user the ability to prioritize which risks are more important for them than the others, such that the system can properly tackle it in that order, because it will never be 100% for everything. So it's the ability to like, hey, like harmful content over latency or over, I don't know, misguided guidance, for example. So we need to bring that feedback and let the user select those as well. So
I see.
but that's yet another dimension.
Okay, yeah.
So,
A lot of things to do.
yeah, it's an exciting world because there's no way to claim ever that you have reached the end goal. It's a journey that you have to keep discovering.
Cool,
Yeah.
cool.
I mean, we're not really working on this, but like one way that I can see in which this type of exercise can be really useful is that once we do this mapping and once we do red teaming at scale and we're able to identify, let's say, hotspots within our space, we can then try to find like meta trends or like patterns within those hotspots, right? Like what is the scenarios that are, succeeding attack wise, where my model is failing, what is the channel of the attack delivery, right? Is it that the model is, or the agent is not respecting permissions or violating its, going beyond its credentials? So then it's like a harness, refinement choice or decision that needs to happen, versus what if the model is like misusing tools in a certain way, or like not able to break down its goals in the way that would allow it, if it's like a goal hijacking problem, then that you have to like retrain the model or fine tune the model in some way rather than the harness. Really, so the goal is to be able to identify these patterns and not just, well, this test ran and my model was, or my system was susceptible to this particular attack. So I think once we have that mapping or that heat map, it will become relatively easier to make those decisions of whether we want to improve the harness or fine tune the model itself.
Got it. Yeah, sounds cool. Yeah, another question. I have a bundle question, sorry. I think in the second to last slide, you show there was some detection score. I guess since we were also talking about language model as judge, so I wonder I think maybe next slide. Like just yeah, here, yeah. So here you have a detection score.
Mhm.
So I wonder, I guess it's using language model as a judge to get a score. Am I correct?
No,
Or-
so Garrick allows you to build your own detectors, and it's up to you. You can build like a a string matching detector, which is like just Python code, or you can use an LLM as a judge.
I
It
see, I
really
see.
is up to you. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And can you elaborate a bit more like on how this detection score works?
So essentially, so the score is 1 if the attack succeeded and 0 if the attack did not. It's a binary score, right? And then you calculate the ASR across all of the scenarios. So it's 1 if the model response contained any of these, contained, let's say, a tool call to process refund, because you get a matching string hit.
I see.
That
I
makes
see.
sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
so
just a
there-
binary. If these exist in the model response, and this is, just a very simple example, you can have it more detailed. You can say if this tool call exists with this particular input, or if this particular, email or outgoing, information exists, then it's a hit, right? And there are we don't currently have partial hits. Yeah.
You want to make a comment?
So, to point out, those are things that those type of score is something you can write.
Yes.
Okay. So it's I mean, then they need to be very customizable to your use case, such that you can measure what you really care about on that. So
So I can either
those are not fixed. I say.
yes. So it can be like customized to user or company, and I can even write my rubrics for the
Yeah.
detection score. Okay. Got
Yes.
it. Got it.
That's kind of the whole, aspiration for this artifact generator, that it generates the test payload, and it also generates the detection mechanism.
Got it. Okay. I think yeah. Thanks for the explanation. I think we are perfect on time. Okay, actually we're late for 1 minute. Yeah, but thank you again, Muneeza. This is amazing. Yeah, we should keep in touch. I want to learn more about this work.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And, this effort is going to expand with the, community that we're launching. So it will, we're all really excited to work on this and collaborate with people. And it's a really exciting space, So
Nice. Yeah. I think sure thing we want to learn more. Yeah, please keep us posted.
awesome. Will do. All right. Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye.
And